From 1964, the Beatles with I Should Have Known Better from the A Hard Day's Night album. Should Have Known Better is the title of the latest book in author Jude Southerland Kessler's John Lennon Series, a unique and ongoing deep dive into the life of John Lennon. In fact, it's without a doubt the most extensive chronicle of Lennon's life and career ever published. Jude is a familiar face and voice in Beatles fan circles, and I've wanted to have her on the program for quite some time, and we're so glad that she's joined us today. Jude, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it, especially this special week.
Absolutely. Just this past Wednesday, we all celebrated what would have been John Lennon's 79th birthday, and last week, when I mentioned that you were going to be on the show to tie in with that, I did find it a bit challenging to describe your books to the audience, because if anyone hasn't read one of your books yet, they're biographies, but done in the style of a novel, but meticulously researched.
Yes, for years I was a Beatles fan from the time that I was 9 years old, and I've collected so many books. I have about 500 or so, probably more than that now, books about the Beatles, and I noticed that there were biographies and coffee table books and art books and books on the music and books on John's art and books on literature, but there was never anything that was written in a narrative format, making the reader feel as if they were actually there, but footnoted, documented, so that every single event is exactly as it happened. What they eat in the book, they actually ate. And I'll tell you a little story about that in a minute. Mm-hmm. What they sing is what they sang in the correct order. Every detail, from the stewardesses to what they wore to what they did when they got off the planes, everything is exactly as it happened. There were 4,400 footnotes in the last book. Almost every time I write a sentence, I tell you where I got the information. So you're getting the exact story, it's just written in a narrative form.
Well, these books are not only incredibly informative, but they're also exceptional works of art. And you mentioned that such a thing didn't exist in Beatledom until you came along. What gave you the idea to apply this genre to John Lennon?
Well, I had been a fan all of my life of the works of Irving Stone, and Irving Stone wrote books like this about Van Gogh and Michelangelo and Abraham Lincoln and a lot of historical figures. For when he wrote the book, The Agony and the Ecstasy of Michelangelo, he moved to Italy for 12 years and did all of his research before he ever put pen to paper. And I thought, that would be so fascinating to be able to tell a story in that way. And when I went to college, I got 2 degrees, one in history, one in English. And then I went on to graduate school and got a degree in research and thought, I'm going to roll all of that together. And I want to write a book that is very factual, but that tells it in a way that people can enjoy it and get into the story and feel as if they're there. But who do I want to write the book about? And I thought, well, I know everything about John Lennon. I'll write about John. And, of course, the first thing you discover when you begin to research someone's life is that whatever you think you knew, most of it's wrong. Most of it's an exaggeration. A lot of it's completely wrong. And I knew nothing. So I did 10 years of secondary research using not just books, but all sorts of periodicals. And at that time, they had tapes, audio tapes. That was before CDs and DVDs.
Right.
And started really getting into the nitty-gritty, and I thought, I can't write this until I go to Liverpool. I have to know where the Washington Hotel is in location from the Empire Theater and how far that is from Matthews Street, and I have to have them turn the right directions. I need to know the sounds of Liverpool, the smells of Liverpool. As Bill Harry said when I sent him the chapter that was written about him, he said, no. You have me in the wrong room of Ye Crack. You need to move me to the back room. You need to have me sit under the painting of Lord Nelson, and you have me drinking ale. I only drank bitter. So I had to know a lot of details that would bring the story to life. So I started going to Liverpool every year for 7 years and spending every second interviewing all the people that knew John. Rod Murray, who lived with him at Gambier Terrace, Helen Anderson, who was his best friend in art college, of course, the inimitable Alan Williams and Bob Wooler, and Beryl Adams, who was married at one point to Bob Wooler, but worked for Brian at NIMS, Frida Kelly, on and on and on. Anyone that knew John in any way, I met, sat down with, took notes, and finally, after 20 years of research, was able to come out with the first book. And it's so funny because my nephew, who was little at that time, I think he was 5 or 6 years old, said, "Aunt Jude, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure, Cole, what is it?" And he said, "You say that you're going to be writing 9 books in this John Lennon series." And I said, "That's right." And he goes, "And it took you 20 years to write this one, right?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Aunt Jude, you're not going to make it."
From 1974's Walls and Bridges album, John Lennon with Number 9 Dream. Beatles author and expert Jude Southerland Kessler joins us today. And I know that you wanted this series to run at least 9 volumes, but I have a feeling that it's probably going to take a few more to wrap it up.
It probably will, because we're in book 5, and I'm only up to 1965. I'm working on 1965. It's so difficult to leave things out. And if I do, for example, in Volume 1, I didn't mention John's first girlfriend, Barbara. And again, that's a huge book. It's an 850-page book, but I didn't put her in the book. And I've had so many people write and say, "What were you thinking? How could you possibly leave her out?" So, you try to jump a few days, and then you read what they did in those few days that you're omitting, and you're like, "I can't do that. I can't leave it out." So it may. You are absolutely right, David. It could end up being longer, but I'm trying to really stick with the storyboard as much as I possibly can.
Well, if you ever get a letter like that about something that you may have left out of a book, you could always, in a future volume, say, John Lennon was sitting drinking a cup of tea, and then his thoughts returned to that time.
You know what? If you don't mind, I'm stealing that idea.
Right. That way you could work all of that in.
I love it. That is brilliant. That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm no joke. I'm really taking that idea.
Okay, that's great. Now, you said that you became a fan when you were 9 years old, and presumably a Beatles fan, not just a John Lennon fan. But he seemed to obviously be the Beatle that you, as a young person, zoned in on.
Well, actually, the very first day that this friend of mine, Patty Singer, came up to me and showed me, I think it was a Capitol, or no, it couldn't have been, because it was before 1964. It had to be a VJ or a Swan release of one of the Beatles 45s, and she said, these are the Beatles, and everybody's in love with the Beatle, and so you have until recess to fall in love with one. I was this very scholarly, studious girl. My mom would always say, go out and play and quit getting your nose in all these books. So I really wasn't that aware of the Beatles. I mean, this was December 63. This is pre-Ed Sullivan. Mm-hmm. I just didn't know about them. And so she showed me this photo, gave me 2 hours to fall in love with one, and I initially chose George. And when I did, I could see that all my friends were just crestfallen. That isn't at all the person they thought I would choose. So that night I went home and I called a bunch of my friends' older sisters and asked questions about the Beatles. And when I got off the bus the next day, I said, I've changed my mind. I'm in love with John Lennon. And they all started jumping up and down and squealing and cheering, because they thought that the leader Beatle, the serious Beatle, that would be the one I'd fall in love with. And so here we are, 50 some odd years later, and it's still John.
If I fell in WFDU FM.
We're back talking to author Jude Southerland Kessler. You can find out more about her books on her website, johnlennonseries.com. As much as I have a reputation as being a Paul booster, I do feel that McCartney has been unfairly maligned over the decades. If I'm really honest with myself, I think the Beatle I identify with the most is John. I came from not a great childhood situation, and I was someone who doodled and was artistic and still am to some degree. And I was also someone who appreciated a great sense of humor, and it was through John Lennon that I discovered The Goon Show. And I discovered Peter Sellers, Spike Milligan, Harry Seacombe, and became a devotee of theirs, just like John. So of all of the Beatles, he's the one that had the most influence on me. And he's the one that I truly do identify with.
And, it's funny because when I was writing the books, back before the first book came out, I really thought that I was writing for those girls who were at the airport with their signs and their hairbands that said, "We love the Beatles." And I thought that would be my audience. But my audience, 90% of my readers are men. And of the 10% remaining, most of them are the new millennials, a lot of 20-year-olds and teenagers. Very, very few women read this series, mainly men. And as I started doing my interviews for 63, 64, 65 with people like Larry Kane, who interviewed the Beatles when they came to America the first time and then went with them on the 1964 North American tour, and with Art Schreiber, who was on the 64 tour, and Ivor Davis, who was the only journalist that was on both 64 and 65 for the duration. He was there from day one to the end. Every single one of them ends up saying the same thing to me. Well, I like Paul, and we got along great. I like George, but John was my favorite. Everyone, and every time I do an interview, I ask, what was your relationship like with the Beatles? Every single one says, I identify with John. John is the one that seems most like me because, and this is the reason I'm writing these books, it's not because John was a great songwriter, musician, singer, performer, which he was, not because he was an unbelievable single-line artist, had his place in the 1960s world of art, or because he was a peace activist, or because he pushed for Irish freedom for England and was a real champion of Irish rights, nor because he championed women's rights and really worked. None of those things. I'm writing because of exactly what you said. He had a tough childhood, a childhood that would have crippled most people, and an even more difficult teenage years. Very crippling, very tragic, tragedy piled on tragedy, but he never let that stop him or deter him or conquer him. He took all the horrible things that happened to him and he turned them into the most beautiful music of our lives. And so that determination and that refusal to let life beat him is what I really like best about John.
And I would think that John, also as this very mercurial character who could change his mind about things on a dime, is an exciting subject to get into as well.
He is. Yeah. He is, and very controversial. People will, say to me, "Oh, well, John had a bad temper, and John was at moments abusive to Cynthia," which she will tell you in her second book, her 2005 book, John, that he was at moments. He had a bad temper. So I don't understand why you like him. Well, first of all, had we walked in John's shoes, had our mother and father, for complicated reasons, given us away to an aunt and uncle who would rear us for our childhood years, had we lost the only person that really showed us any love, Uncle George, right as we were becoming a full-fledged teenager when John was 14 and a half and needed that male role model, had our mother then come back into our lives as a best friend and encouraged us to skip school and hang out with her and taught us to play the guitar and encouraged us to form a band and was our not only our mentor but truly best friend, soulmate, and then was killed. And then we found another soulmate, someone who really was beyond a friend, more than a brother, Stu Sutcliffe, and then he died. If we had all those things happen to us, no telling how we'd act. So John is mercurial. He turns on a dime. He can be in a good mood and then in a bad mood. And he's exciting to write about. But I applaud him for just being able to get up in the morning and get dressed and move on, because he's carrying with him so much baggage that he wouldn't be allowed on a plane. I mean, it's huge. So I applaud him just for getting through the day. Yeah,
and those tragedies continue because you'll get to it. Brian Epstein dying. I mean, another surrogate father figure to John.
Exactly. Yeah. Even though they're only a few years apart, we forget that when Brian first saw them on the 11th of November, and he speaks, well, he goes into the cavern on the 9th and then makes that 11th approach to them and says, wants to talk to them in his office, and he wants to make them a loose managerial agreement. He's 27. He's 27. He's barely older than they are. And yet he's always a father figure to them. And everything comes unraveled after his death. We all know John's famous quote, and it came true. They totally were at loose ends once Brian was gone. And for John especially, because he traveled with Brian much more than is known. After his first trip with Brian to the Spanish Riviera, people always call it the Barcelona trip. Barcelona was only the last 2 days of a 2-week trip. But after that trip, everybody made fun of him and gave him a hard time. And back in the 1960s, being gay was not something that is as completely accepted as it is today. And John was embarrassed about his trip and upset by it. And, of course, as most of us know, ended up hitting Bob Wooler for teasing him about it at Paul's 21st birthday party. So he and Brian traveled together many, many more times, but they didn't make it public. They kept it very quiet because John didn't want to be treated like he was treated the first trip. So the loss of Brian was larger for John than it was for all the other Beatles. They were very close friends, and as you say, he was a father figure to him. So once again, he's lost another family member.
We know that as much as John loved Brian, he could be cruel to Brian. In fact, he could be cruel on occasion to a lot of people that he loved. He was very complex, but then again, who isn't?
Yeah. He did the same thing to Stu. When they are going off on that very first tour with Johnny Gentle, and Stu wants to bring his art box because he's missing classes. He's at Liverpool College of Art, and he is well respected as an artist, and he wants to paint on the trip and to keep up with his studies. And John makes fun of him, actually makes him cry about the whole thing. And if John were in a bad mood, he would go for the juggler. When I met the gentleman who had been the prefect or head boy at Quarry Bank Grammar, John's high school, when John was there, he said to me, his first comments were, he didn't really want to talk about John. He was very reluctant to talk about him. And he said, in my opinion, John Lennon was a salt. And I don't mean salt of the earth. I mean a salt in an open wound. He found what got at you, and then he would use it against you. So, John would needle people, and especially if you were soft. Stu had a soft heart, very soft heart, and he loved John very much. Brian had a soft heart, and he loved John very much. And so there were those moments when John was in a bad mood, when he'd use that against them. But then there were moments when somebody tried to attack Stu, as we all know, after either Latham or Litherland. We're not quite sure. There are different stories. And John went out and saw a whole gang of guys kicking Stu and hitting Stu, and John, without anyone else to help him, jumped on them and broke his little finger in the fray. He didn't even hesitate. He just jumped right in. He was constantly standing up for Stu when Paul wanted him out of the band and saying, no, he's in, he's not leaving. He could be a loyal friend. And same thing with Brian. I mean, he was always the one who loved Brian. In fact, right before his death, he sends him that bouquet of flowers with a note that says, I really love you. So he was very devoted, but when he's in a bad mood, beware.
We're talking with author Jude Southerland Kessler today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop, and there has been a movement over the past 5 or 6 years or so in the media to focus on very negative aspects of John Lennon's life and play them up to discredit him. The criticism being that John Lennon wasn't really woke, in today's vernacular. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there was a BBC radio program called Hero or Villain. Have you ever heard that show?
No, but I see where you're going.
Right. So they had, now I'll just give you a quick example. They had a panel of experts, and they talk about a famous person, and they decide whether they are a hero or a villain. I don't have to tell you how it ended. I think you can you can figure out.
Yeah. Well, I think if you asked John, are you a hero or a villain, he would, of course, immediately pick villain. He would never pick hero. In fact, one of the things that upset him most in 1965 was the fact that people were treating the Beatles like gods. And he said, we're just a rock and roll group. We're no different from anybody else, any other band that's ever played. We're just a rock and roll group. And the more they did it, the more uncomfortable it made him. He talked to Ray Coleman about the fact that it was crippling his ability to write music. It was upsetting him. It was one of the reasons he was drinking and eating so heavily, because of this hero image that he didn't want. He just wanted to be what he called himself years and years later, a working class hero. In other words, not a hero at all, an ordinary man, just a regular guy. So after he dies, he becomes a saint.
Right.
He's always pictured in the white suit, possibly with a dove, and he can do no wrong. And John would have hated that so much. I mean, he wanted to be remembered in his leather pants, in the Cavern Club, sweating, throwing a sandwich at the audience, telling them to cheer up whenever they tell him, you're no good. He was a man's man. He was a northern man. He was no saint, and he didn't want to be a saint. He wanted you to see him with all of his flaws and his foibles and to accept him the way he was. And I think it would have galled him to be represented as a saint. But in truth, John was, like all of us, good and bad. In college, he went on the bus from Mimi's house until he moved down to Gambier Terrace. Every day he'd get on the number 27 Canning Street bus. He would travel to college and back, and there was Phyllis McKenzie was on the bus with him. And he would notice that if she paid her bus fare, she didn't have money for lunch. So when Phyllis started getting on the bus, her fare was paid. And she never could get out of John that he paid it, but he did. He'd see girls standing in line in the Cavern Club queue waiting to get in, and they would have had nothing to eat all day because they were using their money to pay to get in the cavern. And he'd ask them what they wanted for dinner and send out. He didn't have a lot of money. He's still playing in the Cavern Club. He's not rich. And he buys them food while they're standing in line. He constantly, Helen Shapiro on the Helen Shapiro tour, he was the one who helped little Helen and made sure she was okay and took care of her. This little 16-year-old overnight star that he's taking under his wing and taking care of. She adored John. It's always this way. He was a good man, but a good man quietly. And sometimes he got blamed for things that he didn't do. I mean, that old quote that John said, Ringo's not the best drummer in Liverpool, he's not even the best drummer in the Beatles. John never said that, ever.
Yeah.
And Mark Lewison proved it was a comedian who said it years after John's death. It wasn't even John who said it. But he's blamed for many things that he didn't do.
I'm sick and tired of...
The funny thing is, despite John's reputation as this volatile personality, when it comes to fan interaction with any of the Beatles, 9 times out of 10, the most positive stories and certainly the best stories and most entertaining are encounters with John.
And even if you didn't want to bother him, but he could see in your eyes that you cared, of this friend of mine from years ago, she was actually walking down the streets of New York City, and he was walking toward her, and she did not want to interrupt him. And so she looked at him, he looked at her, they made eye contact, and then she decided not to say a word, but as she walked past him, he reached out and squeezed her hand and walked on.
Fantastic.
I mean, just always there for the public. Never one to say, I mean, I don't know if you've, in the latest book, the newest volume that's out on 1964, the Beatles go to this tiny, tiny town, Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, to travel from there up to the Ozark Mountains, where in Alton, Missouri, they're going to have a couple of days of rest and relaxation after this long, long, grueling tour. And when they return after a couple of days of fishing and riding horses and riding go-karts and learning George was driving the truck on the farm and just having a good time, the Beatles are exhausted. They're at the end of this long 1964 tour. When they return to Walnut Ridge, the town has found out that they are going to be returning to the airport. It's Sunday morning. Everyone's gone to Sunday school and early church, and they're there in their Sunday best. But the mayor has told them they're not allowed to scream. They're not allowed to run. They're not allowed to do anything, but they must stand respectfully and let the Beatles get on the plane. And when the Beatles get on the plane, the mayor comes on the plane and says, would it be possible for you to come out for just one moment and let them take photographs? I wouldn't let them do it, and I didn't want them to bother you, but could you come out for one moment? And John says, sure, we'll come out. And Paul says, no, will you, to Mal and Neil, will you tell them that you said, no, we can't come out? Because they're worn out. I mean,
right.
I'm not blaming Paul at all, but John would have done it. You know, he was always available to the fans. So, in answer to the hero or villain thing, the other thing is we cannot go back and judge people today on standards that existed 50 years ago. You can't point to someone who opens the door for a woman and say that was a demeaning act in 1950, because in 1950 that was a chivalrous act.
Right.
We can't judge people, and one of the things that John gets judged on most harshly was doing the step on stage where he would stomp his feet and clap his hands, what he called the spastic move. And he's not making fun of disabled people when he's doing that on stage. What he's doing is he's making fun of the way the fans are acting. They're tearing their hair and screaming and crying, throwing things, dangerous things in some cases, a can of fruit in one city, which would have killed the Beatles.
Wow,
lipstick cases, which were so dangerous. And, Paul got hit by one just below his left eye, could have been blinded. But he's looking at this crazy way people are acting, and he's reflecting it by what he's doing on stage. But he gets judged by today's standards. We don't do things like that. That's not kind. That's not polite. But this was 50 years ago, and that's what people need to keep in mind.
So, if you and you just have actually telling us a little bit about the time period that you cover in the latest book. So it's all of '64 and into early '65. Is that the latest book?
Yes, Volume 3, which was She Loves You, covered the first 2 months of '64. At the end of Volume 3, the Beatles, of course, go to Paris for those 3 weeks in January and find out that they've made it to the top of the charts in America. They have that grand pillow fight, and Brian takes them out to dinner, and they're so elated. The rumor is that the Beatles were never going to come to America until they made it to number one. And that is absolutely a rumor, as Bruce Spicer has said for years, because they had already scheduled the trip to America way back in the fall of 1963. They were going. They just hoped that they were going to have a number one. But they find out that they actually have achieved that, and they come back and get ready to go to America for the 3 Ed Sullivan shows, the Washington, D.C. concert in the Round, which is one of the best concerts that they ever played. And then Carnegie Hall, their trip to Florida, fantastic visit to America, and that is the end of Volume 3, when they're on that plane, flying back to England, getting ready to face 1964, which is without a doubt the hardest year in their lives. There is no doubt about it. That's the end of Volume 3. So Volume 4 picks up as they land in London Airport, now called Heathrow Airport, and they are getting ready to start making A Hard Day's Night. Not only making A Hard Day's Night, but at lunchtime, they're going to be giving interviews to journalists and reporters, radio stations, and when the other actors go home at 5 o'clock, the Beatles are then going to be whisked away by car to do radio shows like Ready, Steady, Go. And at night, they perform and record their radio and TV shows, and when the TV shows end and they're able to go home, John goes home to Jonathan Cape's publisher, Tom Mashler, who is waiting for him to help John edit his new book that he's putting out in his own right. And he works on that until midnight. So it is just an unbelievable barrage of events. And this goes on all year long. A world tour, a North American tour, the release of A Hard Day's Night and all of the premieres, the making of Beatles for Sale, as well as the soundtrack to A Hard Day's Night, and that long, long UK tour, they are just worn out by the time 1964 finally ends.
And they get to do it all over again in 1965.
Yeah, except for this time without the fun, because they've already done it.
Yep.
You know, this time in 65, the book I'm working on now is 1965, and it's called Shades of Life, because that's what 65 was, a mere carbon copy of the year before, only a shade of life. They've done the world tour. They've done the North American tour. John puts out a second book. They make the second movie Help. It is exactly the year before. The dates almost coincide exactly. How boring can that be, doing it all over again?
Now, where would people go, Jude, to get all this information and these books? Where would be the best place to go?
Well, my website is JohnLennonSeries.com. They can read a sample chapter and see if they embrace this genre. You know, either you love it because you like reading it as a narrative. What I do at the end of every chapter is give them all of the facts in the chapter and say, let's say, for example, at Paul's 21st birthday, because there are 18 different accounts of what John did at that party. Let's see who's right. And we begin to go through all of the accounts, and we single out which ones are exaggerations, which ones are plain not true, and which ones are on the more factual side. So there's that component, as well as the 4,000 footnotes, which have additional information at the back of the book. So if you love the genre, JohnLennonSeries.com, of course, they're also on every single ebook format that you can imagine, as well as on Amazon, and thefest.com carries them as well. So lots of places, but I think the website is the least expensive of those options.
Well, again, I want to thank you so much, Jude. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and hopefully you'll come back on the show again, and you'll be on book 23 probably.
Probably. I hope so. Thank you so much, David. This is so much fun. Perfect way to celebrate John's 79th birthday.